in this thing, there's a distinction between essence and existence because its nature is not to be. Its nature is to be a coffee mug, right? Therefore, I've got to look outside to explain its being. What I have to come to, though, is something whose nature is to be, in whom, therefore, essence and existence coincide. Now, Exodus. All right, Moses says to this voice coming from the burning bush, you're a god. I mean, you're impressive. And you know me, you know my people, and all right, I get it, you're a god. But which one are you? You know, the gods of the mountain, gods of the place, God, which one are you? So tell me, when they ask me, what's your name, right? And then God's famous answer, from which this whole tradition I've been talking about comes. I am who I am. In other words, Moses, don't ask me stupid questions. Don't ask me what kind of being I am. I'm not a kind of being.
Robert Barron is a very important man. There are, if I get it right, 275 active bishops in the U.S. and about 2,700 worldwide. And everybody knows who this one is. He is a BA and a PhD and various other things, a licentiate. He's been a priest and a pastor and a professor. Now he's a bishop. He was an auxiliary bishop. And he's the founder of a huge thing in his 25th year, Word on Fire. He's all over social media. I have one recommendation, and that is you should begin the practice, available on Sunday afternoon or evening, of watching his Sunday sermon, free of charge. You'll find them inspiring. I do. Also instructive. So the question is, why is he so important? And the reason is there's something only we can do, and we all want to do. We want to know. Bishop Barron knows, and he is wonderful at explaining. What a blessing. Welcome, Bishop
Good to
Barron.
be with you, Larry.
Thanks. So I think we'll try to go from man to God today.
Okay.
So the first question I have for you is, what are we?
Well, it depends on what framework you want to employ. I mean, I would say we are children of God. We're made in the image and likeness of God and destined for friendship with God. You go back to a classical framework and say we're the animals that talk. So with the zoon logikon, as Aristotle would say. And you could say rational animal, logical animal, but logos just means tongue. So it means the animal that speaks. And I think a lot of human culture, a lot of human life comes from that fact that we speak. And I would bring those together actually as a Christian. I mean, God speaks and God has a logos. And we are endowed with a likeness unto God, which has a lot to do with speech, which means thinking. So I put it in that framework. I mean, as a Catholic bishop, I'd say we're beloved children of God made in his image and destined for real friendship with him. But one of the ways you express that is precisely through this strange activity of thinking.
So what's speaking to do with thinking?
Almost everything. I think thinking comes out of that. It comes out of conversations. I like you, I'm very indebted to Aristotle, and that a lot of this happens in the context of friendship. I'm not a Cartesian. Descartes goes into the heated room in Ulm all by himself and then comes up with the cogito and thereby invents modern philosophy. And to me, there's something perverse in that. I'm much more at home with Aristotle, who begins with, well, what do we mean when we say certain things? And when we talk about this among friends, what are we intending? That, to me, is a much healthier way to commence the thinking project. So it comes kind of up from the ground. It comes up from the rough ground, not from some abstract intuition, but from the way real people, real friends actually talk about their life and their experience. And thinking is born of that. It's born of conversation among friends. Now, you can refine it and you give it a very abstract characterization, but the beginning of it is in what we're doing. It's in conversation. And then I'd press that theologically too, is who is God? We don't just say a monolith, but God is something like a conversation, the Father and the Son, the Spirit being the shared love between Father and Son. There's something like conversation at the very heart of reality. And so as we engage in conversation, we're imitating God in a way. So I think thinking comes up out of that very rich, loamy sort of background. And Aristotle had it more right than Descartes. And a lot depends upon that, I think. Are you more Aristotelian or more Cartesian? Many moderns are Cartesians without knowing it. And I was trained, thank God, as a young man in classical thought, and especially Aristotle. I think of great masters I had at Catholic University who were deeply Aristotelian and Thomistic. And there's something, to me, very healthy about that. And it forms your sense of self and culture very differently than the modern project, which tends to begin in the Cartesian manner. So a lot depends upon that, I think.
So there's a passage in Book 1, Chapter 2 of Aristotle's Politics. Animals then use their voices to distinguish pleasure and pain, indicate pleasure and pain, but we use ours to distinguish the just and the unjust.
Yeah.
So somehow this voice,
yeah,
and it lets us understand abstractions.
Yeah.
How does that work?
Yeah, well, here I go to Thomas Aquinas, who was deeply influenced by Aristotle, of course, but gave it a distinctive spin. Thomas refers to the intellectus agens. I've always loved that. In the Latin it's the acting intellect. Agens, it's a participle. The mind is never like just an empty theater that gets filled up with things. It's an organism that's moving, it's going, it wants things. When we perceive something, so like animals, we can perceive the world around us and maybe have that elemental, is it pleasurable or painful? But the human mind isn't as simple as that. It looks at this and then it says relentlessly, quid sit, that's Aquinas in his Latin. What is that? What is that? It's searching after the, call it objective intelligibility, right? That makes this thing what it is. And it searches that out and it finds an answer. It makes a judgment. Oh, that's a coffee mug. But then it's not satisfied with that. It never is. The mind is restless, just like a conversation, right? You and I are talking and we come to a certain point and say, oh yeah, we kind of settled that. Well, then we just go home. No. Now we're more excited. There's another question, or probably another 10 questions because we settled that one, and then on we go. And the best conversations are like that, aren't they? They're always open-ended. So the mind says, quid sit, what is that? Well, it's a coffee mug. But then it keeps asking that question. It's like a kid. I always think we knock that out of children, sadly. Stop asking such stupid questions. They're not stupid. It's the way the mind works. So now, well, what's a coffee mug? Well, that's a type of reality. Well, what do you mean? What is that? And on the mind goes until it wants to know the very nature of being. And that's how Aquinas sees the trajectory of the mind. It's not happy with just knowing this particular thing or this category of things. It wants to know, what's the nature of being? What does it mean to be? That's the trajectory of the mind outward. And that's what thinking is all about. Thinking is following that trajectory as far as it goes, with a kind of reckless abandon. And it's disciplined all the time by conversation, I would say. See, I don't think the Cartesian retreat into interiority is the way to resolve it. I think it's in conversation with friends that we understand the nature of reality, even to ultimate reality, the nature of being. That's what the mind's about. That's what we want. We're hungry. The mind is, Lonergan said this, there are two types of emptiness, the emptiness of a box and the emptiness of a stomach. The box is just dumbly empty, and you can put things in it. But the stomach might be empty, but it's not dumbly empty. It knows what it wants. And so it seeks what it wants. Well, the mind is like that, right? It's empty in the beginning, but like a stomach. What it's hungry for is being, if I can say it in a desperately abstract way. It's hungry for being, for objective intelligibility. And it does it by starting with something as simple as this cup and moving upward and outward. That, to me, that's the excitement of philosophy. That's what philosophy is meant to be. Little kids have it by nature. They have it by nature. They ask that question spontaneously until we knock it out of them in favor of this sort of modern pragmatism. Like, oh no, just ask pragmatic questions. No. The really interesting questions are the questions after being. Now, see, Heidegger got that when he said, the Frage nach dem Sein, the question after being. Well, yes, I think Aquinas articulated that much better than Heidegger did. But that is the dynamism of the mind.
Yeah. On the way over here to, you were driving my Cybertruck.
Yeah.
And immediately good at it, by the way.
Was I? I didn't feel very good at it.
But we encountered my grandchildren.
Yeah.
And the great Charlotte, and of course these are the best grandchildren there are anywhere. The great Charlotte has named herself the Queen of the Unicorns. Unicorns don't exist.
Yeah.
But she knows what they are. She knows what a queen is. She's 4. William has named himself the king, he's a boy, of the beast. He knows what a beast is. Isn't that odd?
Well, what struck me when you just said that, that is very closely related to Aquinas' early treatise called De Ente et Essentia, on being and essence, where Thomas says the mind is able to distinguish between, in essence, what something is, and existence, that something is. And his sign for that is, I can think of, he said, the nature of a phoenix, even though there are no phoenixes. But the mind can distinguish, say, well, I know what that would be. I know the essence of it. So your granddaughter said, I'm the queen of unicorns. Well, there are no unicorns, but she knows the essence of unicorns. She can hold that idea in her mind. That means she has implicitly a knowledge of the real distinction between essence and existence, upon which all of Thomistic metaphysics depends. So, see, that's to my point. This little kid, how old is she, 4 or something? 4. Yeah, she knows that. And Aquinas, if you go back to that early treatise, he wrote it when he was 25, a young man. It hinges upon that distinction. Because finally he'll get to God by means of that distinction. Because in God, essence and existence coincide. But you got to be able to distinguish before you can unite. Your granddaughter distinguished them. Because she knows there are no unicorns. She knows there really aren't any unicorns. But yet she's the queen of the unicorns because she can conceive of the essence of a unicorn. That's a very, and I'm being a little cute in saying that, but that's a very important move of the mind. And it's the foundation of Thomas's metaphysics.
And in human, it's automatic.
Yeah, right. That she has a very clear sense of that early on. I mean, the mind can make that move.
Now, are you saying, I wouldn't go very deeply into this with most people I know, but I will with you. You know. Are you saying that a unicorn has an essence but no being?
Yeah, that you can understand the nature. Someone said, well, a unicorn is a horse that has a horn coming out of its forehead or whatever. And he said, okay, I can form the idea of that. Not just an image, by the way, but a real idea of it. But I also know there are no such things. So there's no instance of a unicorn. But I can distinguish between essence and existence, therefore. I know that what it is and that it is are two separate things. And that will have huge implications for metaphysics.
I can tell you that the definition you gave of a unicorn is insufficient.
I'm sure.
It's not just the horn. Yeah, it also is colored like a rainbow and has wings.
Okay, yeah, good.
It's very important to know.
It's very important. No,
so this using your voices to distinguish justice and injustice. Yeah. Justice is a moral virtue.
Yeah.
So some sense of that comes from the voice.
Yes, because we're interested in the true, the good, and the beautiful. So the great transcendentals, they're called, are related to being. So whatever is would be true because it corresponds to the searching mind. It has an objective intelligibility. Whatever is good because it appeals to the will in some ways. The will wants the good, and the good is identical to being. And whatever is splendid in some way. Even the simplest thing, like an insect or a little mote in the air, there's something splendid about it. So we seek those three things through our speech. And one of the things we seek, indeed, is moral goodness. So, that's basic in the Platonic dialogues. They're often searching out moral questions, right? What's just, what's unjust, what's righteous and not. And that happens through speech. That's a very ancient practice. And we refine our knowing through speech. In a way, see, thought is a mimicking of speech. I'm with Aristotle there. I come back to the way normal people, ordinary people talk about things. That's where thought comes from. But one of the things we seek for sure is the moral good.
And Aristotle writes that the good and being are convertible terms.
Are convertible terms, right.
Thomas Aquinas writes that too.
Yeah, and for that very reason, because they're transcendentals of being. So wherever you find something that exists, it's ipso facto good. The will seeks it in some way. See, Thomas would say the will is a function of the mind, that when the mind understands something as good, it ipso facto wills it. So the will is like a modality of the mind for Aquinas. So I can know you under different aspects. You're the president of Hillsdale College, you have this background, you're this age or whatever. But then I can say, I know Larry Arnn as good. When I know him as good, I want him. My will is awakened, and I want to be in some kind of union with you. I want to get to know you better, and so on. So the will is a function of the intellect, and they're both predicated upon our knowledge of being.
So there you go. Now, justice.
Yeah.
Good and being and being is different from essence, and good and being are convertible terms.
Yeah.
And justice is an instance of the good.
Yeah.
Kind of good. Does that mean that justice means treating each thing as it is?
Rendering to each his due, right? Isn't that Plato's classic definition? And, what's the right ordering of a community? But I think rendering to each his due is so elemental and so helpful. What's due to somebody, and what is that? And justice is the acting out of that conviction. But what's the right ordering of a community? And again, if we're logical animals, or animals who speak, well, speech can take place only within some kind of communitarian setting. The fact that you and I are here speaking, but we're within the context of Hillsdale College, or we're in the context of a political community, that's why politics, ethics, metaphysics are all related to each other, I think. Again, Aristotle, right? You can't separate them out in some radical way. My capacity to speak is dependent to some degree upon the political arrangement I'm in. If I were in a totalitarian political arrangement, I couldn't speak my mind. I couldn't have a real fruitful conversation. And so those are deeply related to each other. We need justice to find the truth. See, that's the point. We need justice to really seek the good. So John Paul II will say that is freedom is not doing whatever I want, but it's just having the right to do as I ought. Right. So but those are established by a political community. What gives me the right to do as I ought? Well, thank God I'm in this political arrangement that gives me that right. They're all deeply connected to each other.
In that passage from Aristotle, which is one of my favorites, and I quoted, he then goes on to say, politics arises from this speech.
Yeah.
Because through it, we can know the good.
Right.
And through it, we can share that. And if you put morality and rationality together, you get politics.
Yeah. Quite right. Well, of course, Aristotle will define the human being as zoon logikon, as we saw, but then famously also zoon politikon. He's the political animal, and he's the animal that speaks. Well, those are coterminous, really. You can't have one properly without the other. But see, a lot of that is lost, I think, in modernity. A lot of that is compromised in modernity, and it becomes very much this inward-looking Cartesian sort of move, or the Kantian move, that there's a difference in the way the philosophical project is undertaken classically and in the modern. And I would say there's a decline, largely. I have always advocated the recovery of the more classical understanding of things. It's in community that we find the truth. And I'd speak there as a Catholic. Catholics are very big on the community. We're very big on it's within the body that we find the truth. Think here of a John Henry Newman, that he says ideas develop. Well, how do they develop? He says in the play of lively minds. And I've translated that for my students as a game, like you're playing a game of tennis, and you hit the ball, well, in a certain position with a certain spin, a certain speed, and then your opponent's got to deal with that, and then he sends the ball back with his own answering spin or whatever it is. And the game goes on precisely in that beautiful play. Well, the mind is like that for Newman. See, Newman was reacting against certain modern tendencies and wanted to recover the play of lively minds. That I share an idea with you, and you say, yeah, okay, I get that, but what about this? And you send it back to me, and I go, yeah, that's a good point. And you're right. And we're tossing a diamond up, and it's catching the light in different ways, and we catch it. And I'll throw it up again, and it catches the light. What's Newman's line? It's a real idea is equivalent to the sum total of its possible aspects. I think there he anticipates phenomenology. Where Husserl will say it's only like something as simple as this, only by walking around it and from all angles and how the light catches it and how I see it from here and now from there. That's how I intuit the essence of this thing. I can't get it with one glance. So right now I'm looking at it, you're looking at it. And then I'll say, hey, but what about this? And yeah, but what about that? That's how the mind unfolds. It's a zoon logikon, and therefore zoon politikon, because you've got to have a political arrangement that makes that sort of conversation possible, right? It's not, I'm going to retreat into my private room and I alone will intuit what's going on. That's, I think, both anti-classical and anti-Catholic. The Catholic is the sense of it's the body. What's Chesterton's line? The democracy of the dead, right? So that I listen to the voices even of the long dead. I'll listen to the great tradition. What did Aquinas say about this? And what did Aristotle say about it? And what did John Chrysostom say about it? And what we're doing is turning the phenomenon, let's say, of the incarnation around and looking at it from all these different angles. I like that model of knowing.
I just jumped in my mind what you were talking.
Yeah.
I commend Bishop Barron's sermons again to everybody. And what they're like is they are conversational. Mm-hmm. It's just you talking. Nobody talks back.
Yeah.
But it's a conversation.
Yeah.
Is it because, why? Why do you do it that way?
I think because what I've been talking about, that's sort of an instinct in me that's the best way to come at truth. There's an authority that comes out of the tradition, sure, and I'm a bishop. I speak, out of that tradition, because it's not a Derridean, permanently open-ended, who knows anything about anything. It's not that at all. It's the opposite, really. I've come to know a lot of things, and there's so much more I can know. And so I'm inviting a conversation with somebody else to, fill in what am I missing or complete what I've just said. And that's the development of doctrine. I love that idea in Newman, where Newman says, the doctrine develops like the way a river unfolds. I'm stationed now up in southern Minnesota, so you go about 5 hours north of me by car, and you come to the source of the Mississippi, like Itasca. And the source of it is this little tiny thing. You could leap over it, Then you go down to New Orleans, and you see it at the mouth of the Mississippi, this giant. Well, that's the way the life of the mind goes. Something can begin very, very small, and then through time and space, it unfolds and tributaries come in and it responds to challenges, and that's the tradition. Did Aquinas, for example, understand the Trinity better than St. Peter? Likely, Newman says, even though Peter received the revelation of it. Peter knew the second person of the Trinity, right? Which Aquinas didn't directly. But might Aquinas have understood the Trinity better than St. Peter? Sure, because doctrine had unfolded from that time. It was in sort of acorn form in St. Peter, and then it's this mighty oak by the time you get to Aquinas. That to me should be a commonplace.
If I've got one more big point about politics. When the Declaration of Independence says all men are created equal, what's it saying?
To my mind, it only makes sense within a theological framework. Because obviously we're not equal. We're radically unequal in almost every way you could measure. In size and strength and beauty and intelligence and moral virtue, we're all radically unequal, seems to me. Where are we equal? And it's given away in that line. We're created equal. We're equally children of God. We're equally related to God. That's why I think, and I think this whole institution is kind of based on this assumption, if you take God out of that equation, God help us, because then that basic sense of equality evanesces.
So one way all he's saying is, because everything is created, right?
Yeah.
The cup is created cup.
Yeah.
We are created this.
Yeah.
And so the point is, all he's saying is all men are men.
Yeah, but if we simply stay within an anthropological framework, then all the inequalities will kick in very quickly, and then there's the danger of tyranny. So why can't the powerful pick on the less powerful? Why can't the intelligent dominate the unintelligent? So the fact that we're anchored in God, to me, is massively important politically.
God is named 4 times in the Declaration of Independence.
Yes, and look, I would say, speaking as a Catholic, do you have a full sort of Thomistic metaphysics informing the founders? No. To me, there had been a certain falling away from that. Nevertheless, you've got an extraordinarily keen sense of religion, of faith, of the relation to God, which is indispensable to our American democracy.
John Paul II, I had great affection for him, as so many do. I got on to him because he kept talking about the Declaration of Independence.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
And the point is, God in the Declaration is a legislator, a judge, an executive, and a creator. And the lesson being, you'd only put those 4 things in a single set of hands if it was God. And that would mean then that our equality is an equality below God and above the animals.
Yeah.
So there's I actually think there is a picture of the cosmos in the Declaration of Independence, and you couldn't locate yourself
properly without
if this was the only thing you knew. You couldn't know it was a singular thing.
Right.
But you compare, and similarly us.
No, I think that's quite right. That's quite right. There's so much going on there that I think is interesting. One is, with John Paul in mind, the question of rights. Because what John Paul did was very clever, is he took the rights language of the more modern tradition. So grounded in someone like Hobbes or Locke, that I have a right to that which I cannot not desire, says Locke, like life and like liberty. I cannot not desire those things, therefore I have a right to them. Well, John Paul would have resituated that a bit within the more explicitly theological framework, that we have rights because of our dignity, which comes from the fact that we're created and destined for eternal life. So once you see that, well, okay, then government exists indeed to preserve those rights, yes. But he kind of reconstrues the understanding of rights, which I think is an important move. The other thing I find really interesting about the founding and classical Catholic thought is, to what degree were Jefferson and company influenced by someone like Robert Bellarmine? We know that Jefferson had Bellarmine in his library. They were certainly influenced by Hooker, the Anglican divine, who himself was deeply indebted to the scholastics. And you do find in Aquinas, for example, this late career text he writes on politics, where he says, look, in an ideal world, the best government would be a monarchy, like the divine monarchy of the universe. If you have a intelligent, good, just person who governs by his morally informed dictate, that's the best kind of government. But then he's very quick to say, however, I know that person is exceptionally hard to find or control. So a more likely ideal is some combination of the monarchical and the aristocratic and the popular. And you see there something like this tripartite, arrangement. So that has been in the tradition from that time. It comes up through someone like Hooker into Jefferson clearly. Someone like Bellarmine, who maybe influenced Jefferson. I find those connections fascinating between classical Catholic thought and the American founding.
Yeah, Jefferson owned and had probably read every book.
Yeah, that was available at the time.
When Madison went to write the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, Jefferson was in Paris, and he wrote to Jefferson and said, "Send me books."
Yeah.
Send him 200.
Yeah.
And so
it's amazing, huh?
They read a bunch of stuff.
I remember my great mentor at Catholic University, Robert Sokolowski, taught me a lot of things I've been saying this morning. But he taught us political philosophy. We marched from Plato to NATO kind of thing, went through the whole tradition. And he said the American founding was something of a miracle, that so many people of such extraordinary high caliber were gathered in one place at one time. And you think of it, what's like it in the history of politics, that you have the moral authority of a Washington, but then you've got an Adams and you've got a Madison and you have a Hamilton and you have a John Jay and you have Jefferson. How did that happen? And it was a miracle how they came together, and what they produced is something. and we're the benefit. And the fact that you and I can have this conversation on philosophical matters is a function of what they did. They made that possible. Thank God.
Yeah, Aristotle writes in the Politics in Book 5. How do tyrants endure? How do they keep it up?
Yeah.
People don't like it. Well, they have to forbid high thoughts.
Yeah.
And friendship.
Yeah, that's right.
And private
That's right.
conversations.
That's right. And we see that, right, played out over and over again. In our own time, we've seen that. And Aquinas, in that, it's called the De Regno, this late career text on kingship. He wrote it to the Duke of Sicily, who had asked for something, and Thomas writes this as a gift to him. But he's preoccupied with tyranny. It's all over the place in that, is the danger of tyranny, how to identify a tyrant, how to control a tyrant. And I reread it recently for a paper I'm working on, and I thought, he sounds like an 18th century figure. He's so attuned to the dangers of tyranny. And that's deep in us in a healthy way. We're suspicious of tyrants.
Oh, yeah.
Thomas thinks you can kill a tyrant, that it was morally legitimate to kill a tyrant. Just as if someone who's posing an immediate threat to someone's life, well, a tyrant's posing threat to the body politic, and they can be taken out, he teaches, which is a rather extraordinary thing to say.
Yeah. Yeah. Man who loved life.
Yeah.
How do we get to thinking about God? How does that come up?
Again, I'm more Thomistic on this question, where I tend to go from the ground up. There is a great tradition within Christianity, Augustine's example of it, that would see God as the prius, the prior of all thought and action. That I seek the true and the good and the beautiful only because I already have a sense of the unconditioned good and the unconditioned true, that God has, as it were, already seized me and then sent me on these quests. That's a very venerable tradition, and I respect it, certainly. I'd be more Thomistic, that you start with things like this, that we're these animals, that we have eyes and ears, and like a little kid making his way through the living room and checking things out. And we begin on the rough ground again, right? But then that relentless intellectus agens pushes. Quid sit. What is that? What is that? And then out I go. And I'm going to ever higher levels of abstraction. That is to say, ever higher levels of intelligible patterning, if I can put it that way. So what is that? That's a coffee mug. That's a very low-level, intelligible form. But now I'm saying, well, what's a coffee mug? And now out you go, to ever higher types of intelligibility. What are you seeking ultimately? You're seeking being. What does it mean to be? But then you're seeking, where does being come from? See, because being, I'm speaking in a very high abstract way there, but being manifests itself to us as contingent. So here's this coffee mug. It is, no question about it. It is. It's boldly there. But is it necessarily there? Obviously, no. I mean, I could throw it to the ground and break it. It could be 1,000 degrees in here and the thing would melt. It could be 10,000 below zero and the thing would break apart. It might not be on this tabletop and might be on the ground. Everything about its manner of being, it is for sure, but it doesn't have to be that way. It's contingently there. Now, the same process. As I make that analysis, I say, okay, well then, how about the things that make it to be what it is, like this flat tabletop? Well, that's dependent upon this floor has to be stable, or this tabletop wouldn't be here. Well, what about the temperature of the room? Well, that comes from all kinds of factors, from the electrical system here to the weather outside, et cetera. Okay, are those contingent states of affairs? Well, sure, because the weather depends upon the planet and what's going on. See, so the mind relentlessly goes out from this very particular contingent thing to ever higher expressions of contingency. Ultimately, to that which isn't contingent, that which exists by its very nature. This is, but it doesn't exist by its nature. It exists because of all kinds of contingent factors. I finally come to some reality that doesn't exist that way. It exists because its very nature is to be. And I can't explain this stupid little cup until I've come to that point. Now, there's Aquinas and company with some of the classical arguments for God's existence. But see, I think what those are, they are explicitations of something that implicitly everybody gets. You know, someone who's never read a page of philosophy, but by a deep intuition, they get what I've just been saying, that the world they experience is a contingent world. But I can't explain it, therefore, by an endless appeal to other contingent things. I've got to come to that which is. Now, go right back to the beginning of our conversation with your granddaughter and the distinction between essence and existence. Right? In this thing, there's a distinction between essence and existence because its nature is not to be. Its nature is to be a coffee mug, right? Therefore, I've got to look outside to explain its being. What I have to come to, though, is something whose nature is to be, in whom, therefore, essence and existence coincide. Now, Exodus. All right, Moses says to this voice coming from the burning bush, you're a god. I mean, you're impressive. And you know me, you know my people, and all right, I get it, you're a god. But which one are you? You know, the gods of the mountain, gods of the place, God, which one are you? So tell me, when they ask me, what's your name, right? And then God's famous answer, from which this whole tradition I've been talking about comes. I am who I am. In other words, Moses, don't ask me stupid questions. Don't ask me what kind of being I am. I'm not a kind of being. If I were, I'd be in the contingent nexus like everything else. No, my name is no name. Because to name is to say, I'm specifying. I'm saying you're this and not that. You're Larry Arnn, I'm Robert Barron. That means we're different from each other, right? So which God are you? Which kind of being are you? Dumb question. I'm not a type of being. Now Aquinas, notice the deeply mysterious comment he makes, that God is not in any genus, not even the genus of being. It's fascinating. So this is a genus. It's a genus of objects, physical objects or something, let's say. And they say, well, and it's certainly the genus of being, right? It's a being. Yeah. And I'm a being, you're a being, that's a being. Well, what about God? He's certainly in that genus, isn't he? Says Aquinas. He's not in the genus of being. If he were, he'd be one being among many. He'd be a contingent thing. God is that whose very nature is to be, you know. So that's how you get, if you want, from something like this to God, is by the relentless hunger of the intellectus agens, the agent intellect that wants, what is it? Seeking intelligibility until it finally comes to the limit case of intelligibility, which is, I am who I am, right? That would be the path that the classic Catholic tradition takes. So
you could make, I submit, a similar argument, leaving out what you want, what the mind wants. But what the mind wants is logic, logos. The mind is logos.
Intelligibility. Yeah.
And so to explain this logically, any explanation short of that will be insufficient.
Will be inadequate. Exactly right. Yeah, and that's why you see all forms of materialism. When you say all that there is matter and energy or matter and motion or something, see, the mind just balks at that. That's why the new atheists had this superficial charm, especially for young people, because, take that religion and all that. But see, the mind will never be satisfied with so matter. That's all there is. No, for Pete's sake, matter. What kind of matter? What color is it? How fast is it going? Where is it? See, because matter never exists as such. Aristotle knew that. They call it prime matter, right? But prime matter exists only in some informed way. So you have to ask the question, well, okay, what kind of matter are we talking about? Well, once you do that, you've now said, okay, I'm dealing with a contingent state of affairs, which I have to explain. And you can't endlessly appeal to matter to do that because you're always stuck in the realm of contingency, which is why the prime reality, that whose nature is to be, can't be material. Now we say things like, well, that's why God, we say, is a spirit. We don't mean he's a ghostly being among other beings, like Casper the Friendly Ghost. No. What you mean is, well, whatever is material, that can't be God. That can't be God. Now, what does that mean positively? I don't know. I don't really know. But I can tell you, the source of all existence can't be a material thing. Can't be a finite thing. Why? Well, because finitude always plays off other finitude. But that whose very nature is to be has to be prior to any kind of ontological differentiation, which is why I say God is one, etc. Now, I mean, what does that really mean in itself? I don't know.
I had a friend, really wonderful man, named Robert Jastrow. He was the president's science advisor. And
oh, yeah, I recognize the name, yeah.
Really great guy.
Yeah.
And he was, I'm speaking of a man that I adored, and it was an extremely honorable man, and a famous scientist.
Yeah.
And he once read a paper at a conference that I put on 400 years ago by Sir Fred Hoyle, famous physicist.
Yeah.
And Sir Fred made the argument of the Big Bang Theory. There was this big old lump.
Yeah.
And, and everything starts with that. And before everything starts, there's no time because there's no motion. They went through all that. Right. It's a wonderful argument. Maybe true. And so when he finished, I asked Robert Jastrow, I said, where'd that lump come from?
Yeah, exactly, right.
And Jastrow looked at me and winked and said, we can't know that.
Yeah, but see, that's what I say to the atheists. I've been in these dialogues for years. Like, you guys stop asking the questions when they get really interesting, right? But see, my intellectus agens, well, it's not satisfied with that. There's a lump. A lump where? How big? What color? What velocity? I mean, what are you talking about? A lump. You're saying, well, the beginning of all things is some kind of prime matter. Well, that doesn't help me at all. And Aristotle knew that. Aristotle knew it a long time ago. You can't just say, well, prime matter, that explains everything. It can't possibly. Which is why he invokes, the prime mover that gives form to matter. Okay. Now, his answer is ultimately an inadequate one, but it's a lot better than, it's just all prime matter. But we haven't advanced beyond that, philosophically speaking, if that's all we come up with. So, the scientists, they're great, and they're with so much more rigor and detail telling us about, what happened after the Big Bang. But philosophically speaking, we haven't made any progress if that's all we're saying. You have to appeal beyond mere matter to explain the contingent world.
So, I think it's a doctrine of Aquinas that any explanation of God that we could understand would be wrong.
Would be less than God, yeah.
And
he says whatever can be known or understood is less than God, right. In
a way, then, that explanation is also somewhat unsatisfactory.
Which one?
Well, that, you can posit, and we're going to talk about the Christian God next.
Yeah.
It's something else.
Yeah.
Something additional. But you can see how you would need God to explain the cup.
Yeah.
But if the explanation you get to at the end is, if the explanation is satisfactory to you, it means it's insufficient.
Well, you might say, there's something true about it, to say that you have to appeal finally to non-contingent being to explain contingent being. I think that's a fair, true statement. Now, what's the nature of that reality? I'm always going to fall short there, because my knowledge of God, is again Aquinas, is largely negative. The via negativa. I take away from this idea creaturely imperfections, like matter, time. That's why I say God's eternal. What does it mean to be eternal? Well, I have a rough idea, but my experience of things, they're all in time. I say God's immutable. Well, why? Well, because mutability means that you're under the influence of some external cause, therefore you're contingent, and that can't be true of God. But what does it mean to say God positively is immutable? I don't know. Because what comes to my mind is like the Rock of Gibraltar, that's immutable. But that's not at all what God is like, So in that sense, right, I'm always going to fall short of understanding the nature of God. Most of my work, Thomas says, is like sculpting. I'm taking away what God is not. And that's the best we can do in this life. And that's why we're filled with hope for a life when we will see. Hence the Visio Beatifica. There's this vision that will give us joy. And we glimpse it through a glass darkly now, but that's why we're longing for it.
That's why, that's very good about that sculpting.
Yeah.
Michelangelo said he
Right.
chipped away the part that wasn't the statue. But
Exactly, yeah.
Aristotle's metaphysics, which is a bit complicated, is a kind of process of elimination.
Yeah. Yeah.
God can't be mutable.
Right.
You can't move. You can't have matter. It's a bunch of things that would impair him if he had them. So imagine the thing that is unimpaired and perfectly unimpaired. C.S. Lewis says one of the evidences for God is that it takes us a long time to learn.
Mm-hmm.
Wouldn't it be better if we knew everything at once?
Yeah.
Thomas, this and Thomas too. We go from thing to thing to thing to thing.
Yeah.
It's you've been describing that, right?
Yeah, yeah.
It's delightful to do that. Wouldn't it be good to do it all at once?
The way angels know. So Thomas is called the angelic doctor, partly because people thought he knew the way angels do. In fact, he didn't, but it was the swiftness of his mind. But yeah, angels would know without having to go through this laborious process of seeing, imagining, abstracting, judging, and that's our process. And then speaking, comparing, conversing. We have to go through this kind of laborious process to know, where an angel would know in a single glance. All right, I can spend my life resenting the fact that I'm not an angel, or I can get to work.
Try to become one.
Right. But, that built into us is such a desire to see. And that's an argument, for the truth of heaven, of this beatific vision. The fact that I'm hungry means there really is food, right? So the fact that I'm hungry for this ultimate knowledge of God, that drives me on and fills me with hope of something beyond this world that I'm limited by my body and so on. But that's a source of hope, not frustration.
Yeah. If trying to understand that,
yeah,
you're on a quest to understand something perfect.
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah,
you can. C.S. Lewis writes a very powerful passage, I think, that we can examine ourselves and see what's best in us and what's worst in us. And then we can imagine a being the best only and perfected. Evidence of God is in here, in our form, in our being. Now, in Mere Christianity, which I think it's
such a great text.
And it's sort of it's the way you describe the American founding. He's one of those flashes of lightning that hit.
And thank God he didn't listen to his colleagues, right, who said, oh, come on, Jack, you're a 17th century literature expert, write learned articles on that, and not this popular apologetics. Thank God he ignored those people, and wrote this masterpiece of Christian apologetics. But it hung by a thread. I mean, he very well might not have written that book, but it's been maybe the most influential of the last century in terms of religion.
And it goes from the moral.
Yeah.
Starts with the moral.
He makes the moral argument, yeah.
And then shows that we got to think about God. The question just comes up.
Yeah.
The nature of things and the logic of things. And then he turns to the Christian God.
Yeah.
And that's different. Something else.
It's something more, yeah.
And so let's talk about that.
Yeah.
Why does the Christian God answer these questions best?
Yeah, and I'd first say, any well-informed sense of God will answer a lot of the questions we've been asking, and that's important. Thomas calls those preambula fidei, preambles to the faith. And Lewis knew about that. That's a big part of Mere Christianity, is that there are these preambles to faith in the strict sense that predispose you to belief, that make belief credible. It's like, I always think in terms of a personal relationship. So I met you, almost 2 years ago. I had maybe read a little bit about you before. I heard your name. Maybe I'd looked on a Wikipedia search or something. I would have known a few things about you on my own, steam. Then I met you, and I was able to take in, much more data, and that coheres with what I had heard about him, and I was assessing things. And then you would say certain things that I wouldn't have gotten from a Wikipedia article. But let's say our friendship developed much further and it reached a point where you were willing to tell me something about yourself, about your heart or your mind, that I would never, ever, ever been able to get from a Google search or even from talking to your friends or even from watching you in action. I couldn't have gotten that. It's only when you revealed it to me. At which point, I'd have to make a decision. Do I believe you or not? One evidence would be, well, okay, so what he's telling me now, is that totally out of step with what I already know about him? If it is, then I'm kind of skeptical about it. If it is coherent with what I already know, but it's telling me something more, I come to know this man, and I rely on him, I trust him, so I'm going to believe that. Well, that happens all the time in our human relationships. Why wouldn't something similar be happening with God? That there's a lot I can know about God. Everything we've talked about so far is largely from Aristotle and from Thomas Aquinas' metaphysics, and that any bright enough person could follow those arguments and come to know very important things about God. Indeed, those are very important things. Okay, good. That's why, as a Catholic, I like reason. Luther, I reverence Luther in many ways, but one of his worst lines is he says, "That whore reason." I mean, and he's like Tertullian. What does Athens do with Jerusalem? And there is that tendency within Christianity just to say, no, it's all faith and forget reason. Look at Karl Barth. I reverence Karl Barth, but he had some terrible things to say about reason. I like reason, and it's very important. But does there come a point where God will speak and say something that, man, I would never have gotten that. I would never have gotten that from the highest metaphysical speculation. God spoke his heart to me in a way that it's astounding, confounding, marvelous, dark, light, all of it. But am I predisposed by what I know about God and my relation to God to say, yeah, I believe that. I believe that about God. I'm thinking here, obviously, of Jesus, but what makes Jesus intelligible is Israel that came before him, right? He's intelligible only in light of Israel. The cross of Jesus. If you were to say, to Aristotle, you see that 30-year-old rabbi being put to death on a Roman cross on this crummy hill outside of Jerusalem. You see him? That's the Son of God. That's the second person of the Blessed Trinity. That's the Word made flesh, who's dying for our sins. Aristotle, what in the world are you talking about? Doesn't make a lick of sense. And Paul knew it, right? It's folly to the Greeks and it's scandal to the Jews. I mean, no one's going to get this. Is ridiculous, and yet this is the word of life. That's where the Christian difference comes in. Is yes, the same God in whom essence and existence coincide. That one, the source of all reality. Yeah, that one. The one who spoke to Moses out of the burning bush and gave his name along those lines. I am who I am. That's the full manifestation of his heart. That's what his heart is like, and it's pierced by a spear, and it's being poured out for us. Aristotle would never understand that. Do you remember in the Confessions of Augustine when he's talking about the problem of evil, and he said from the Platonici, from the Platonists, he learned about evils of privation of the good, and that helped him solve the problem, which was bedeviling him, right? I learned that from the Platonists. Great. What I never learned from the Platonists, though, was the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And so, see, there's Augustine again. Reason, great. I learned a lot from the Platonici. They're terrific. They helped me an awful lot, but they couldn't get me over that bridge. That bridge had to come from a revelation from God. And look, either you believe it or not, and some people, for all kinds of reasons, find belief very difficult. But it's like a human relationship. I could know a lot about you, and I could tell people, and I'd be right about various things. But if you told me something that I could never guess otherwise, I'd have to decide, do I believe it or not?
In the metaphysics,
yeah,
Aristotle defines God as thought. And the question is, what's he thinking about?
Yeah, self-thinking thought.
And the answer is himself.
Yeah, right.
Because it's the same kind of argument that proceeds through. If there were a being who was pure thought, and he spent some time thinking about something lower, he would be inferior to one that didn't. Elimination. So the last thing in the world you're going to have is a God thinking about us. Now, it don't happen because I'm putting this to you because you're a great Aquinas scholar, better than I. In the Summa Contra Gentiles, if I remember correctly, in chapters 54 through 59, roughly, Thomas Aquinas sets out to reconcile Aristotle's account of God with the Christian God. Mm-hmm. Do you know that argument?
Tell me more. Which one are you thinking about? Yeah.
What he says is that the Christian God is love, this activity of love that you described. Mm-hmm. It's the reason it makes sense if there are three parts.
Yeah.
And that's a kind of a deduction. But it's so abundant.
Yeah, that it overflows
to everything.
Yeah, right.
And because it's perfect, it also knows everything, including us.
Yeah.
Made us, but it did that out of an overflowing. So it wasn't a change in it.
Right.
To do this. And what's interesting to me about this is you're a priest and a pastor, and your first answer to my question was a pastoral answer. Somebody will talk to you and tell you valuable things.
Yeah.
And you couldn't get them anywhere else.
Yeah.
That seems true to me. In addition, there's an answer by some of the greatest minds. According to those minds, the answer would be insufficient, that seeks to reconcile the steps you would take to understand God by reason alone. And those steps, Aristotle's metaphysics is a sort of provisional. Mm-hmm. Aristotle has a certain humility about things.
Yeah.
Things are hard to understand.
That's a great virtue of his, yeah.
But here's an effort. And it's, I invite the text that I'm referring to, which I've read many times, is maybe all of those chapters together, 20 pages long. Mm-hmm. They're a little dense, but they're kind of fun.
Yeah. But those are super important moves, though, right? And there's a Platonic side of that because the bonum diffusivum sui principle, right? The good is diffusive of itself. Thomas got that from like the Pseudo-Dionysius and people like Irenaeus in the Church Fathers who were mediating Platonism. And then he used that to great effect. If the good is diffusive of itself, you understand creation, right? So the kind of overflow of God's goodness. But you also, Thomas argues, for the fittingness of the incarnation. So he mounts all the usual arguments against incarnation. So things like you were suggesting, how grubby that God would be involved with matter and so on. But the answer is it's convenience, he says, or fitting. It comes together properly because bonum diffusivum sui. If God is supremely good, which he clearly is, and if the good gives itself, well, what greater giving would there be than that God would become out of love one of us to save us? I remember when I first came across that as a young man, I was immediately convinced by it and thought, yeah, it's not a strict argument, and Thomas acknowledges it. It's not an argument from necessity, but from fittingness, convenience. Isn't it fitting that God, the supreme good, would indeed go so low as to become one of us? So, that's the Philippians hymn then. God did not deem equality with God a thing to be grasped, but rather emptied himself and took the form of a slave. And Thomas justifies that in terms of Plato there. Because he plays both the Aristotelian and Platonic side of the good. So for Aristotle, it's more, the perfect that I seek. That's the good. And so God is good in that sense. But then Plato is more, no, the good is what's diffusive of itself. The good is what gives being. And Thomas uses both of those, often playing them off each other in his treatment of God. But I think that's a great principle to justify both creation and the incarnation.
Mm. One obstacle that Christianity faces, it always faces obstacles. One of the obstacles that's prevalent today is that it's a bad and oppressive thing. Mm-hmm. Is it that?
No, I mean, there have been lots and lots and lots of bad Christians up and down the centuries, including today, people that abuse the teaching of the church in different ways. Has there been institutional corruption? Certainly. We can find that from the earliest days through the Middle Ages and into the modern times, for sure. And, religion, as Paul Tillich said, is ultimate concern. And so that's both beautiful and dangerous. And that's always been the case. If something's your ultimate concern, well, you'll kill people over it and you'll do dastardly things over it. So that's always accompanied religion like a shadow, and that's true to this day. Look, my whole priesthood practically was under the shadow of the sex abuse scandals. They broke in Chicago, my home diocese, in the early 90s. I was 6 years ordained at that point. And then the rest of my priesthood has been under the shadow of it. So I know about very bad behavior on the part of religious people. I know about institutional corruption. And then everyone in the postmodern period is deeply sensitive to how institutions corrupt or they oppress other people. Okay. Yeah, all the above. But I'm with Newman, or I'm with Paul. We hold the treasure in earthen vessels, right? The treasure is Christ and his life, and it's embodied in the sacraments and the Eucharist and the saints and the great theologians. We have that treasure in very, very fragile vessels. Okay, get used to it. That's the way it always has been, always will be. But the treasure remains, and the treasure is why we're about this. And the treasure is what we want to share with the world. And maybe at times the broken vessels allow the treasure to get out. That can happen paradoxically, is that the very corruption of the institution, maybe it allows the treasure to escape and people to see it more clearly,
The on the oppression front, the way it was prepared for me to have my faith restored by Jewish teachers.
Yeah. A
man named Harry Jaffa, a great man.
Yeah.
Wrote a book called Thomism and Aristotelianism. He loved Thomas and he loved Aristotle. He thought he saw a difference between them that he rethought later in life. Never mind that. One thing I learned from him was that when Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world," that is the opposite of oppression. Mm-hmm. And it requires, if God is the all-powerful, all-loving, all-making of everything God and the only route to salvation, and he doesn't set up a government, then the government must leave you free to worship him. Mm-hmm. Religious freedom is written there. And Professor Jaffa used to say, I answered a charge against the college, one of those weasel charges you get once in a while. Somebody wrote an article in a paper in Idaho. They are adored by people who believe in the Christian nation.
Yeah, right.
So whether we did it or not, somebody who did likes us. And I wrote and said, well, those people would be mistaken.
Right.
Because there can't be such a thing.
Yeah, right.
In other words, a Christian polity would not put a man like Jesus to death. Mm-hmm. That set me on the way to understand what I had learned as a boy, but forgotten. Christianity is a good thing, and it's for freedom.
Yeah. No, it has to be, because the respect for the person and also a moral life has to be predicated upon freedom. If you compromise freedom, you compromise morality. And so you can't, you've got to have one to have the other. There's always a paradox, I remember it was Rabbi Sachs of happy memory. He was the chief rabbi
knew him a little bit,
in London, right? And he said, if you want to know the first great text of secularism, it's Genesis chapter 1, because God creates a world that's not God. So all these things come forth and they're beautiful, they're good. God calls them very good, but they're not God. So they have their own integrity. Now, they're dependent upon God and they're destined for union with God and all those good things, but they're not God, which means there's a space that's opened up for science, politics, friendship, all of human affairs. We're not suffocated by God's presence. We're always enlivened by it. We're liberated. Eat of all the trees in the garden. So we always ignore that. We rush to the one prohibition, which is, the prohibition is beautiful because it means don't pretend you're God and making up the moral rules. But once you stay away from that tree, eat of all the trees. Off you go. Off you go. Have a richly human life. So that's the space that's opened up indeed for politics, economics, conversation, friendship, all the things that we love, sports, entertainment. It has their own integrity. And God delights in that, call it relative independence. You don't want to make them totally independent of God, but in that relative independence, God delights. That's why he made the world. I'm not a little piece of God. I'm not a little aspect of God's being. I have my own ontological integrity. And that's beautiful. So that's a legitimate side of secularism, if you want, or of the political experiment.
So we're going to close. It's your 25th anniversary of Word on Fire.
Yeah.
You want to say a word about where that's going and how it's going to be greater yet?
Yeah. Proud of it. We started very small. It started with a radio program at 5:15 on Sunday morning in Chicago, and grew. And it grew because of the social media, I think. And we started with the old media. It was basically radio and TV when I got going. But then along came the social media, and we just decided, I know better than almost anybody how bad the social media can be and what a shadow it carries, like everything else in the fallen world. But we saw the promise of it, that it could carry the gospel into the world in a way that had not been carried before. And so we jumped in with both feet, and YouTube and Instagram and all these things. And then I did films that I wanted to be very beautiful, as well as it would tell the truth of the faith. And I think that all paid off. It was a risk that paid off. And we had investors early on, donors that said, okay, we'll give you a shot here. That's how it got going. And it's done, well beyond my imaginings. I go all over the world now, and wherever you got the internet in the English language, which is pretty much everywhere, you've got access to what we're doing. What I want for the future is a religious order. So I'm very aware of my own, mortality, and I don't want this thing just to end with me. If I got hit by a bus walking out of the studio, Word on Fire probably would go under, It's too dependent upon me. So I want to form an order of priests that would have this, what we call charism in the Catholic Church, that would have the sort of inspiration of the Spirit to do what I've been doing, to reach out especially to the unaffiliated, to use the new media to do it, to be smart, crackerjack apologists, all of that. So that's where I see as the next move forward. We're continuing with our films, and we have bigger goals for production. We've also developed a beautiful publishing branch and bring out these marvelous books, kids' books, more popular books, serious academic books. I founded an academic journal, as well as a journal. You had Todd Warner, I think, didn't you? Todd was visiting here. He's a marvelous guy, and he edits our journal called Evangelization and Culture, which is more of a popular journal. So at all these levels, I'm trying to, bring the message to bear. But the order probably is the way I want to bring it forward the next, 25 years.
So that's not entirely dissimilar from the way Hillsdale College works.
Yeah.
And, I will say on behalf of the college, all of us, and especially I'm very proud to know you, and we look forward to working with you in the future.
God bless you, Larry. Thanks.
Thank you.